Hey there guys, so we're taking a look at The Witcher 3 next gen update running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U, but this time we're taking a look at it with 8 GB of RAM. Now we took a look at it with 16 GB of RAM and the conclusion was pretty much that the game was actually really playable, though anything outside of the dynamic resolution scaling gave us some pretty bad performance. And as you can see here at the full 1080p resolution, at the stock 15W TDP, we are getting abysmal performance. This is really just not going to be doable for pretty much anyone. 20 FPS average is already not going to be anything special, but the 1% lows being as low as they are is also going to just make the whole experience really terrible. Though I think no one should be surprised by this level of performance. It already did pretty bad with 16 GB of RAM, and it seems like dropping down to 8 GB did not do this game any favors at all. But we can see what happens when we actually turn on the dynamic resolution scaling, and when we do that, even with just the stock 15W TDP, it does do a lot to make this a far more playable experience. Now, it's certainly not remarkable, and getting 1% lows that are below 30 is still a pretty rough experience, but just in general, this is far more playable than where we were at before. So if you're on a system where you can't really turn up the TDP, you'll at least be able to get around a 30 FPS average gaming experience out of this. Sometimes the FPS will be higher than that, but there will be a lot of other situations where it will really drop down. So it's not the most ideal situation, but if you have really no other way of turning up the TDP or anything like that and you're stuck with 15 watts, this is about as good as it's going to get, because we could look at what FSR ends up doing with this. Though again, I think that we've all at this point learned that FSR 2.0 and all its derivatives from there really have a performance overhead that kind of makes them not really functional with an APU like this. It can certainly be useful on a dedicated graphics card where you have a lot more performance headroom there, and getting a little bit of visual quality improvement by just using the ultra quality or the quality preset instead can be pretty nice. But in an APU where you have to use ultra performance, the overhead of FSR itself running pretty much negates any improvement that would come from the lower resolutions, and instead makes the overall experience worse than just using the dynamic resolution scaling. Again, this is something very specific to just APUs like this. This isn't just a condemnation of FSR in general. FSR is still fantastic technology, but these older APUs really just are too weak to fully benefit from FSR. Now, luckily, we can adjust the TDP on this specific system. Unfortunately, it's not really able to salvage the gaming experience at the full 1080p resolution with a 25W TDP. We pretty much see practically no noticeable improvement. There is technically an improvement just based off of the numbers, but in terms of actually playing this, it's not going to feel great at all, and it's really just not going to be worth even attempting. Of course, we can see if dynamic resolution scaling does any better. And with the dynamic resolution scaling at the 25W TDP, we actually do get an improvement, though overall it's not one that's substantial in the slightest, especially since the 1% lows really don't have that much of a difference from where they were at with just the 15W TDP. In general, you're pretty much looking at around a 40 FPS average in terms of gaming performance, with 1% lows that are just dipping slightly under 30 FPS. So not the greatest experience overall, but if you're both RAM limited and TDP limited, the dynamic resolution scaling is pretty much the only way to realistically get any reasonable level of performance without turning this into an absolute blur fest. So in general, it really does seem like the reduction in RAM is causing us to take a noticeable performance hit, since at this point with the 25W TDP and 16 GB of RAM, we were pretty much getting an average that was very close to 50 with 1% lows consistently above 30. So we're talking an almost 10 FPS drop in terms of our average, though our 1% lows really only saw a few frames of increase. But still, there is a noticeable drop in terms of performance just with 8 GB of RAM, though it isn't something that's substantial. That being said, though, the difference between a 40 FPS average and a 47 FPS average can be pretty noticeable, since one is just so much closer to being at 60. But this is still at least a playable experience, which cannot really really be said about running this with FSR at ultra performance? We pretty much just get the usual FSR 2.0 overhead that ends up really just dragging down the whole experience. Visually speaking, it is a blurry mess while giving us worse performance than just using the dynamic resolution scaling. Now, in general, the game can be playable with 8 gigabytes of RAM. You can still definitely do it. You're not going to be getting an amazing experience, and you're going to notice bigger dips, especially when going into bigger, more populated cities and stuff like that. The limited amount of RAM is going to make stutters far more frequent, but in general, it is at least playable. That being said, if you're on a system with a 5500U and you're going into 2023 with it, plan on squeezing out another year, or you just got a system with it, getting 16 gigabytes of RAM in there is pretty much the biggest upgrade you can do to it to improve your overall experience. And really, you can go all the way up to 32 if you want. Now, it's not to say that 32 is going to make your gaming experience any better. It's just one of those things where having more RAM does actually open up a lot of possibilities in terms of what you can and can't do on here. 6 cores and 12 threads is not a slouch when it comes to a CPU, and you can actually do some pretty cool stuff with a system like this, especially if you feed it enough RAM. But it's not really necessary for gaming. For gaming, I recommend you just go with 16 gigabytes of RAM, and you're looking at a nice little bump in terms of performance that in some games will be the difference between you getting a 60 FPS average or not. But anyways, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.